The year is 1987. The Filipinos were still collectively recovering from Marcos's dictatorship and state sanctioned killings that marked a dark chapter in Filipino history. But Filipinos were also hopeful for the future. They have elected the wife of a national hero who was said to have been assassinated by Marcos's people. Change had come, and change needed to continue to take place. Much needed to be repaired, healed, and rebuilt. One of the things that needed to be healed and rebuilt was the trust of Filipino farmers towards the national government. Farmers across the nation were promised land reforms during the Marcos regime, but instead of making good such promises, Marcos's cronies perpetuated the abuse of farmers. The election of Corazon Aquino therefore provided a glimmer of hope for farmers who finally could dream of being given the land reforms and, most importantly, the justice that they so deserved. What they could not anticipate was that even with a newly elected president who promised so much hope to a tired and traumatized Filipino populace, the reforms sought would not come easily and would later come slowly and at a great price: the lives of those who had been fighting for the farmers' rights since the very beginning. This is the story of the Mendiola Massacre. Mabuhay. You are listening to Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. I am your host, Christine, and welcome to episode 2 on the Mendiola Massacre. Please note that this episode contains details that could be upsetting and disturbing for some people, so please make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening. In order to fully understand the Mendiola Massacre, we need to understand the struggle of Filipino farmers, something that did not just start just before the massacre or even during Marcos's regime, but something that has a long, painful, and bloody history that can be traced back to colonial times. Don't worry, I'm not here to give you a big history lesson. There are excellent podcasts and websites for that. But I will need to provide a historical context so we all know how this problem came about. A historical context is also needed to know how things can go wrong again if the root causes of the problems in relation to land reform are not addressed. This episode will be history heavy, Lagim Fam, so I hope you will still stick around. When our archipelago was slowly but surely being colonized by the Spaniards in the 16th century, they brought along with them a feudal way of dealing with properties that used to be owned by the indigenous pre colonial Filipinos on our islands. Part of the subjugation initiated by the colonizers was to strip the Filipinos of their lands and give them to Spaniards who held positions in the colonial government. The concepts of haciendas and encomiendas were born. When the Spanish sold us to the Americans by power of the Treaty of Paris, the question of land ownership was not addressed. I suppose it was not on top of the occupiers' list at that point. The Americans were slowly becoming an imperial power themselves, and so national internal matters were left to the colonial government. This government was at that time trying to establish itself, and the best way to do so was to get the full support of the elite, aka the landowners, the hacienderos and hacienderas. So, any chance of sitting down and tackling the issue of land distribution to farmers who worked on the haciendas for generations but were never allowed to outright own them was lost. Now is not the time, I can imagine the colonial government saying. In his essay, The End of an Illusion, The Mendiola Massacre and Political Transition in Post-Marcos Philippines, Romel Coraming highlighted that every administration since the Malolos Republic and Manuel Quezon's Commonwealth government had merely paid lip service to equitable land ownership. In the late 40s and early 50s, Ramon Magsaysay pushed for land reform only to be shut down by a Congress that was full of landlords. A watered down version of land reforms was passed instead. This pattern of struggle between the executive and Congress would continue in the Macapagal and Marcos period. And this brings us to Cory Aquino. As I mentioned earlier, Aquino's election to the presidency provided some hope that maybe land reform would not remain a pipe dream anymore. Some people were skeptical, as Aquino herself came from a land-owning elite background. The Aquinos in Tarlac are, after all, a political dynasty that can be traced back to the Malolos Congress. But despite Aquino's background, the hope was there because Cory Aquino was convincing in her promise to implement genuine land reform and redistribution of lands. However, in the months after she was elected as the new Philippine president, Aquino had become more evasive about her stance on the issue of land reform. Calls were made for her to use her executive powers in moving the needle on land reform issues, but she stated that she wanted to wait for the new incoming Congress to legislate on the matter. This was unacceptable for the farmers and activists who had dared to hope for a change after EDSA. Congress, after all, was still, like in its previous iterations, dating back to the earlier versions of the Republic, teeming with land owning hacienderos and hacienderas. Despite campaign promises, it is human nature to be self serving. The farmers and their allies finally had enough. So, how did the Mendiola Massacre unfold? In the lead up to the fateful day, there had already been several demonstrations. The Kilusang Magbubukid ng Pilipinas, or KMP, or the Farmers' Movement of the Philippines, were already camped out for a week outside the Ministry of Agrarian Reform building in Quezon City, starting on the 5th of January 1987. They wanted to put pressure on the powers that be to listen to them and to heed their demands. There were three main demands. Firstly, to urge the government to give lands for free to farmers. Secondly, to not allow landlords to retain lands. And most importantly, to stop the amortizations of land payments. The KMP also noticed that not only had they been largely ignored by politicians and government officials, but they were not getting that much media attention to further their cause. As a result, the group set up a blockade around the building compound to stop the ministry's employees from getting in. To further provoke and to also catch people and media's attention, something I do not fault them for, just to be clear, they then raised their flag beside the Filipino flag. This was a powerful and symbolic act of protest. After this, on the 19th of January, the group's representatives were told that they will be granted a meeting with then Agrarian Reform Minister Corazon Alvarez, but this was postponed. The representatives of the group were finally able to meet him the next day on the 20th of January. The KMP camp demanded what they have always demanded, but Minister Alvarez could only promise to do his best to bring the demands to the attention of President Aquino during the cabinet meeting on January 21st. By the 21st, around 6:30 in the evening, Minister Alvarez advised KMP President Jaime Tadeo and his advisors to wait for the ratification of the 1987 Constitution and to just allow the government to implement its comprehensive land reform program. Tadeo responded that he did not believe in the Constitution and that a genuine land reform cannot be realized under any Congress. As I already pointed out, there has always been a conflict of interest within Congress due to most members being landlords and land-owning people themselves. Being in this position, obviously, they would therefore most probably not legislate against their own interests as landlords, and so genuine agrarian reform was unlikely to become a reality. A heated discussion then ensued between Tadeo and Minister Alvarez, with the latter still suggesting a negotiation panel from each side to meet again the next day. By January 22nd, the group, then led by Tadeo, moved over to Malacañang Palace to present their demands directly to the president. Before doing so, Tadeo talked to the press, and he used this opportunity to communicate in no unclear terms what could happen next. He said in Filipino, "Inalis namin ang barikada bilang kahilingan ng ating presidente. Pero kinakailangan alisin din niya ang barikada sa Mendiola sapagkat bubutasin din namin iyon at dadanak ang dugo." In English, "We removed the barricades here as wished by our president, but she also needs to remove the barricades in Mendiola because we will penetrate those too, and blood will be spilt." On their way to Mendiola, and bear in mind that between the Ministry of Agrarian Reform and Malacañang were at least 12 kilometers, the group picked up further supporters and sympathizers from different groups such as labor unions, students, people who have seen poverty, some intellectuals, and of course, some fellow farmers. Specifically, the KMP crowd was joined by Kilusang Mayo Uno or KMU, Bagong Alyansang Makabayan or Bayan, League of Filipino Students, LFS, and Kongreso ng Pagkakaisa ng Maralitang Lungsod or KPML. It was around 10 in the morning at this point. By 1 in the afternoon, the protesters reached Liwasang Bonifacio, where they held a short program. Some of the protesters at this point had entered the eastern side of the post office building. They then proceeded to remove the steel bars surrounding the garden. Afterwards, they then joined the march to Malacañang. At about 4:30 in the afternoon, they finally reached CM Recto Avenue. Whilst this was all happening, both the police and the Marines were informed that the KMP group and whoever now marched along with them were all heading to Mendiola and Malacañang. Their reaction was to deploy civil disturbance and crowd control units on the Mendiola Bridge, for starters. In later reports, it seems that the military was under the impression that there were members of the Communist Party of the Philippines and the New People's Army amongst the KFP crowd. As it happened, and as confirmed, there were also military undercover operatives within the KMP crowd as well. This did not bode well. The crowd control and civil disturbance units, police and army forces on the Mendiola Bridge had by now formed a 3-tier blockade. By 4 in the afternoon, the protesters were getting very close to the first tier of the 3-tier blockade system. Reports later would say that at this point there were around 10,000 to 15,000 people in KMP's crowd. Then suddenly, a clash occurred, and all hell broke loose. In order to help us visualize what transpired, I will now read out an excerpt from the Citizens Mendiola Commission report. I quote, "There was an explosion followed by throwing of pillboxes, stones, and bottles. Steel bars, wooden clubs, and lead pipes were used against the police. The police fought back with their shields and truncheons. The police line was breached. Suddenly, shots were heard. The demonstrators disengaged from the government forces and retreated towards CM Recto Avenue. But sporadic firing continued from the government forces. After the firing ceased, two MDTs headed by Lieutenant Romeo Paquinto and Lieutenant Laonglaan Goche sped towards Lagarda Street and lobbed tear gas at the remaining rallyists still grouped in the vicinity of Mendiola. After dispersing the crowd, the two MDTs, together with two Western Police District MDTs, proceeded to Liwasang Bonifacio upon order of General Montaño to disperse the rallyists assembled there. Assisting the MDTs were a number of policemen from the Western Police District, attired in civilian clothes with white headbands, who were armed with long firearms. End of quote. Just for clarity, MDT means Mobile Dispersal Team. Okay, back to the story. After the clash, initial reports claimed that 12 marchers or rallyists were officially confirmed dead, although according to Jaime Tadeo, there were 13 people who died. 39 people were wounded by gunshots and 12 others had sustained minor injuries, all belonging to the group of the protesters. Some reports claimed that over 100 individuals were injured and 6 more people had apparently died from injuries they had sustained. As for the police and military forces, 3 people sustained gunshot wounds and 20 others suffered minor injuries. Now, please remember that by the time the Mendiola Massacre took place, the euphoric EDSA revolution was barely a year in the past. Filipinos' renewed hope for a better future after its dark chapter under the Marcos administration was abruptly halted, and suddenly, Filipinos were reminded of the clashes and violence of the last administration, with some commenters saying that the Mendiola Massacre made Marcos appear almost gentle by comparison. Corazon Aquino, who portrayed herself as the polar opposite of Ferdinand Marcos, was put to the test, not only as the head of state but also as a person from a prominent and elite family. Several highly respected government officials also expressed disgust at how the situation at Mendiola was handled, with some even resigning their post. Most notably, Jose Diokno, then chairman of the Presidential Committee on Human Rights, now known as the Commission on Human Rights, resigned. His daughter, Maris Diokno, would later say that that was the only time she had seen her father near tears. For the Aquino administration, who was trying so hard to transition into the new Marcos-less era, it was time to damage control, amongst other things. The new president was quick to commiserate with the family of those who died and of those who were harmed. She reached out to the leader of the KMP and again emphasized that she will address the issue of agrarian reform. It was during this time as well that she issued Administrative Order 11 that formed a fact-finding body, the Citizens Mendiola Commission, something I've already mentioned once in this episode. The commission was tasked to investigate the events of January 22nd. The commission was composed of retired Supreme Court Justice Vicente Abad Santos as chairman, retired Supreme Court Justice Jose Feria, and Mr. Antonio Miranda, both as members. The commission was told to submit their findings no later than the 6th of February 1987, but it failed to do so. So the deadline was moved to February the 16th by Administrative Order number 13. Again, the commission was unable to meet this deadline. Finally, on the 27th of February, the fact-finding body submitted its report in accordance with Administrative Order number 17 issued on the 11th of February. These were the main findings, and please bear with me as there are 12 main findings here. I am quoting directly from a court document which is linked in the sources list. The first finding: The march to Mendiola by the KMP, led by Jaime Tadeo, together with other sectoral groups, was not covered by any permit as required by national laws. The second finding: the crowd dispersal control units of the police and the military were armed with 38 and 45 caliber handguns and M16 Armalites, which is a prohibited act under national laws. The third finding: the security men assigned to protect the Western Police District, INP Field Force, the Marines, and other supporting military units, as well as the security officers of the police and military commanders, were in civilian attire in violation of national laws as well. The fourth finding: there was unnecessary firing by the police and military crowd dispersal control units in dispersing the marchers, also against national laws. The fifth finding: the carrying and use of steel bars, pillboxes, darts, lead pipes, wooden clubs with spikes, and guns by the marchers as offensive weapons are prohibited acts and punishable also under national laws. The sixth finding: the KMP farmers broke off further negotiations with the MAR, or Ministry of Agrarian Reform officials, and were determined to march to Malacañang, emboldened as they are by the inflammatory and incendiary utterances of their leader Jaime Tadeo. The commission quoted what Tadeo said, essentially: "Bubutasin namin ang barikada, dadanak ang dugo. We will penetrate the barricades and blood will be spilled." The seventh finding: there was no dialogue between the rallyists and the government forces. Upon approaching the intersections of Legarda and Mendiola, the marchers began pushing the police lines and penetrated and broke through the first line of the CDC contingent. The eighth finding: the police fought back with their truncheons and shields. They stood their ground, but the CDC line was breached. There ensued gunfire from both sides. It is not clear who started the firing. The ninth finding: at the onset of the disturbance and violence, the water cannons and tear gas were not put into effective use to disperse the rioting crowd. The 10th finding: the water cannons and fire trucks were not put into operation because A, there was no order to use them, B, they were incorrectly prepositioned, and C, they were out of range of the marchers. The 11th finding: tear gas was not used at the start of the disturbance to disperse the rioters. After the crowd had dispersed and the wounded and dead were being carried away, the mobile dispersal teams of the police and the military, with their tear gas equipment and components, conducted dispersal operations in the Mendiola area and proceeded to Liwasang Bonifacio to disperse the remnants of the marchers. And the last finding: no barbed wire barricade was used in Mendiola, but no official reason was given for its absence. Apart from these findings, the Commission also made several recommendations, and I quote again: the Commission recommended the criminal prosecution of 4 unidentified uniformed individuals, shown either on tape or in pictures, firing at the direction of the marchers. In connection with this, it was the Commission's recommendation that the National Bureau of Investigation, or NBI, be tasked to undertake investigations regarding the identities of those who actually fired their guns that resulted in the death of or injury to the victims of the incident. The Commission also suggested that all the commissioned officers of both the Western Police District and the INP Field Force who were armed during the incident be prosecuted for violation of paragraph 4G of Section 13 Batas Pabansa bilang 880, the Public Assembly Act of 1985. The Commission's recommendation also included the prosecution of the marchers for carrying deadly or offensive weapons, but whose identities have yet to be established. End of quote. Now, the Commission did not forget about Jaime Tadeo. They recommended that he should be prosecuted for violating national and criminal law for holding a rally without a permit. The Commission also did not forget about the uniformed perpetrators of the Mendiola Massacre. Now, you will probably recognize a few names here, but the fact-finding body recommended that General Ramon Montaño, Police General Alfredo Lim, Police General Edgar Dula Torres, Police Major Demetrio de la Cruz, Colonel Cesar Nazareno, and Major Felimon Gasmin should all be administratively sanctioned for failing to make effective use of their skill and experience in directing the dispersal operations in Mendiola. And while all these recommendations and findings are something that we could have predicted, the most significant recommendation made by the Commission was that the government should be compensating the deceased and injured victims of the tragedy. It looked like even after almost 12 months, the victims of the Mendiola Massacre did not receive any of that compensation. In January 1988, a portion of the number of victims, known as the Kailao Group, initiated proceedings or instant action to claim damages from the government. The case was docketed as Civil Case number 88-43351. Unfortunately, a month after, on February 23, 1988, the Solicitor General filed a motion to dismiss on the ground that the state cannot be sued without its consent. The petitioners opposed this motion on the 16th of March and maintained that the government had waived its immunity from the suit and that the dismissal of the instant action is against the Constitution and international law on human rights. The Kailao Group's complaint was dismissed because the judge decided that the government did not waive its immunity at all. A motion for reconsideration was filed afterwards by the Kailao Group. And as you can see, there's a dynamic here. One will just respond to the other in order to get what they want. The matter ultimately was brought to the Supreme Court in 1993, and sadly and infuriatingly, the highest court of the land agreed with the Manila Regional Trial Court, who first made the decision to dismiss the instant action by the Kailao Group in 1988. The Supreme Court said that the recommendation made by the Commission regarding compensating the heirs of the deceased and the victims of the Mendiola Massacre by the government apparently did not in any way mean that liability automatically attaches to the government. The court stated, and I quote, "Whatever recommendation it makes cannot in any way bind the state immediately, such recommendation not having become final and executory. This is precisely the essence of it being a fact-finding body." End of quote. Several other reasons were cited by the Supreme Court in the court document I have linked in the sources list, and it is interesting to read it when one has the time, so I do recommend it. Needless to say, this decision was heartbreaking and disappointing. Sure, the court was right about the role and power of a fact-finding body. Their word or their recommendations are not legally binding, but if the government had an iota of good faith and empathy, it would have just compensated the victims without court involvement. We're not talking about wealthy hacenderos here who had all the money in the world to leave to their children or heirs or to spend on expensive hospital bills. We are still talking about the same impoverished farmers who in Filipino history have been called and are still being called peasants, a term so archaic and cringeworthy that we really need to be done with it quickly. Anyway, The Mendiola Massacre was and is seen to be a political failure of Corazon Aquino that greatly damaged her iconic stature as an antithesis to Marcos. The Mendiola Massacre, no matter how you want to dress it up, was state sanctioned killing. Those on the far left, those who were on the side of the farmers, those who hoped for a better Philippines, ultimately were convinced that Aquino was no better than Marcos. Romel Coraming wrote that the Mendiola massacre demystified Aquino's moral authority. As one of the consequences of this demystification, the negotiations between the National Democratic Front and the government broke down, and the fighting between the NPA and the AFP renewed. Just to clarify for those who may not be that familiar with Filipino history, the NPA, or New People's Army, is the military arm of the Communist Party of the Philippines, who has a complicated and difficult relationship and history with the national government and the military, or the Armed Forces of the Philippines, AFP. This has resulted in a lot of armed conflicts over the years in a lot of places nationally. After Marcos was ousted and after Corazon Aquino was voted in to Malacañang, there was hope that these armed conflicts could finally be laid to rest. But with the Mendiola massacre, things got derailed yet again. But what happened to agrarian reform? In an effort to perhaps silence the protesters and save face, the administration quickly acted to have a dialogue with the leaders of several farmers' organizations. But I would not call these dialogues really. First of all, you have to understand, and I think lots of us have forgotten about this, but farmers are literally the backbone of Filipino society next to our OFWs, and both groups have been treated with so little dignity that it absolutely horrifies me. So, the Aquino government agreed to just about the minimum of all the demands that had been made for decades by the farmers. But I guess the farmers thought this was better than nothing. I think they were also waiting and observing whether this bare minimum would even be actioned, especially because when the Aquino administration finally formed all these bodies to deal with nationwide land reform, a lot of anti agrarian reform groups popped up like mushrooms. And they decided to up the ante by giving Aquino an ultimatum. Romel Coraming, who I have quoted so many times in this episode already, worded it perfectly. Either Aquino decreed agrarian reform and faced the immediate threat of destabilization by the anti agrarian reform groups, or she let Congress deal with the matter and forfeit her legitimacy with the so called rural poor, another term that I truly hate, by the way. I think I do not need to tell you what Aquino chose. The Cabinet Action Committee, who was tasked to draft an executive order addressing land reform, ended up with an unbelievably watered down version of the order that was unsurprisingly pro landlord, pro bankers, and pro businesses. When the new Congress finally opened in July 1987, the big agrarian reform problem became a problem for the legislators and not the executive branch or president anymore. There were months of debates, no surprises there. And after all these months of hither and thither about what this piece of law should entail, Congress passed the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. But this was hardly an improvement from the previous executive order that the Cabinet Action Committee drafted. Without burdening you with legalese, suffice it to say that the law was riddled with loopholes upon loopholes that made sure that the 8 million hectares of land that was supposed to be made available to farmers were so hard to even claim. Coraming stated that 80% of private land, for example, was exempt from redistribution. Redistributing public lands was no walk in the park either, so farmers were yet again let down massively. This new law also formed what we now know as CARP, or Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, which, for all intents and purposes, is one shower away from being a failure. This program is known for its slow implementation due to the land evaluation processes of the time, the lack of guidelines for landowner compensation, the troubles with landowner tenant negotiations, and the lack of institutional coordination between agrarian administrative agencies. After only achieving about 22% of its goal, CARP was extended in 1998. Prior to that, further changes were made to the law under President Ramos, with many commercial lands and farms becoming completely exempt from redistribution. The program was extended again in 2009, with the words extensions and reforms being affixed to its long running title to create a new acronym, CARPER. Needless to say, the faith in this program quickly diminished when all these flaws were laid bare from almost the get go. As for the victims and family of the victims of the Mendiola Massacre, their quest continued in 1998. The Kilusang Enero 22, or the January 22nd movement, filed a class action suit against Aquino and some of her officials, including then General Fidel Ramos, but this case was also thrown out for lack of merit. When Ramos himself became president, he did not even address agrarian reform as a high priority matter. He would have been a fool to do so, knowing that he was very much part of the machinery that killed both farmers, farmer allies, and his own military and police people. Coraming also pointed out that the next president, Erap Estrada, also did not seem to prioritize land reform. He was too involved with the big corp players. He planned at some point to exclude over 200,000 hectares of commercial farms from redistribution. Farmer groups did not take this well for obvious reasons. And so, with succeeding administrations merely paying more or less lip service to land reform, the legacy of the Mendiola massacre and its victims was in danger of fading into the annals of so much land related violence. But farmer groups and allies have done their best over the years to consistently commemorate the Mendiola massacre every year by protesting, marching, and raising awareness. And they needed as much support from others and the new generation of voters as possible because another Aquino was waiting in the wings. Noynoy Aquino almost did not make it. His chances of becoming president were greatly reduced when workers at a sugar mill in Tarlac were killed after police forces dispersed a demonstration in favor of increasing workers' wages. This incident will become known as the Hacienda Luisita Massacre. As a representative of Tarlac, Noynoy Aquino stated that the dispersal by local police forces was justified. And this was unsurprising. After all, Noynoy Aquino was also a landowner. But Aquino's reputation was then greatly helped in 2010, not only by the passage of time, but also by the death of his mother. When Noynoy Aquino was voted in, he pretty much won because of the sympathy gained after Cory Aquino died in 2009. My reaction? Well, either people had a very bad memory or the Aquino PR machine really did a great job in rehabilitating the Aquino political legacy after the Mendiola and Hacienda Luisita massacres and other failings during the Aquino administration. I suppose both elements helped Noynoy Aquino become president. And like his mother, he made promises to address agrarian reform. However, in the end, he pretty much took the same route as his mother and dodged any opportunity to address the justice so badly needed by those who were hurt and those who died at Mendiola. At this point, it felt like a deliberate erasure effort. Additionally, and most importantly, the Presidential Agrarian Reform Council, the highest policy making body for CARP, was not even convened during the Aquino presidency. This alone will show you that there was absolutely no regard for the lives and the livelihoods of farmers in the Philippines. Additionally, in 2012, the Department of Agrarian Reform requested a 30 billion peso budget, but only received 18 billion. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised because this absolutely tracks for a president who himself was a landowner. Now, please don't get me wrong. I am deeply respectful of the man who had recently lost his life, but as a past president and a part of Filipino history, we are allowed to analyze his policies and decisions when he was a president. Now, how does it look like with the Duterte administration? According to an article by The Diplomat, and I quote, exemptions gifted to landowners have left thousands of peasants empty handed and resigned to lives of poverty. And with nearly 100 killings related to land disputes and agrarian activism in 2020 alone, one thing is clear. Whatever legacy was born from the massacre on Mendiola Street over 3 decades ago, it has done little to staunch the flow of bloodshed in the Philippines since. End of quote. In 2016, the Department of Agrarian Reform reported that they have distributed 4.7 million hectares of land to farmers under the CARP program. Farmer group activists, however, warn that these results should not be taken at face value. Farmers have missed out so much in the past 3 decades, and the majority of farmers still live in dire poverty. They lack access to support services, and beneficiaries of land distribution have been overburdened by production costs to the point that some of them had to relinquish their land ownership entirely, leaving them without a livelihood. In 2017, there was a glimmer of hope when Rafael Mariano, a protester himself during the Mendiola Massacre and former Secretary General of the KMP, who led the protests and marches that led people to the Mendiola Bridge, was appointed as Secretary of the Department of Agrarian Reform. His appointment was not popular amongst landowners, and indeed, he did his best to approve as many land distribution applicants for land ownership as possible. But after only 18 months, he was fired from his position, and the good work he tried to do in office was prematurely ended. The Diplomat article astutely observed that, like other presidents in the past, Duterte promised to redistribute lands. But not only has this promise only seen very slow fulfillment, there have also been a lot of bloodshed amongst farmers yet again. In the last 4 years, according to the Diplomat, there have been 300 killings of farmers, land activists, fisherfolk, and indigenous people, and 96 killings since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic alone. The struggle continues. And although this episode might have given you a lot of information that is seemingly less true crimey, I personally see the Mendiola Massacre as a complete disregard of the disenfranchised, especially because no one had actually been prosecuted or punished in any way at all for the last 3 decades. The victims and heirs of the victims of the Mendiola Massacre were never compensated. And to add insult to injury, one of the implicated people, Fidel Ramos, even became president later on. If that is not true crime, then I don't know what is. To end this episode, I want to read out a quote from Rafael Mariano, who is currently still trying his hardest to push for genuine agrarian reform in Congress. The quote is from an interview he gave to The Diplomat. He says, and I quote, "That bill addresses the inadequacies of CARP, but I'm not sure I'll ever see the day it's passed. Even so, I'll push for it as long as I can," he said. Reminded of the fate of his fallen friends, Mariano appeared calm. "If you have a lifelong commitment to his movement," he said, "you accept that one day, who knows when, you might also be killed." End of quote. Lagim fam, thank you so much for listening to this episode. And now to my podcast recommendation of the week. My podcast recommendation of the week is Dark Theory, hosted by the smart and spooky Aldwin. Here is his trailer.
The truth, they say, is out there. Trouble is, the truth sometimes can be bland and uninteresting. Subscribe to Dark Theory. Dark Theory is a self-produced Filipino podcast that takes you down a rabbit hole of mystery, conspiracy, and dark, twisted tales that blur the boundaries of what you know to be real. Subscribe to a little darkness. Listen to Dark Theory. Available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Anchor. We make the truth a tad bit more delightful, all with a pinch of darkness. This is Dark Theory.
Lagim fam, thank you again for listening to our second episode of our second season. Always make sure to follow our socials. We are on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook. Just search for Lagim, a Filipino true crime podcast. We have a fan page and also a discussion group page over there. Lagim is also officially on YouTube now, so you can stream all past episodes, including this one, on YouTube right now. If you want to support this podcast, you are welcome to make one-off donations through buymecoffee.com. Just check the link in our Instagram bio. You can also become a patron on patreon.com, where you can get monthly early access to regular episodes and future bonus episodes as well. A link to our Patreon is also on our Instagram bio. Lastly, you will greatly support this podcast by following us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or both. You may give us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, and that will greatly help us find new listeners or have other people find us on Apple Podcasts. That really, really helps. Again, thank you so much for listening. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.